Chapter 3 deals with global economic or the global economic environment, and specifically with global economic integration. So we're going to be looking at how countries working together with one another benefit business on a global scale. So the outcomes that are covered in the chapter, we're going to, after chapter, you should be able to explain the importance of the economic environment, what is meant by economic integration, and we're going to look at things like trade blocks, free trade areas, customs unions, and common markets. We will also look at how trade is created and diverted by means of trade blocks, why we have economic integration, different regional and economic trading blocks, and we'll look at the advantages and disadvantages of each of these. Okay, so what is economic integration? So countries create trade blocks. If you look at that image on the top right-hand area of the slide, there are continents, each with different countries, but they've got different colors there, and that implies that those countries work together with one another with regards to trade. So they form what is called trade blocks, which means that goods can be transported across borders more easily with less restrictions, i.e. less taxes and levies and requirements than between countries where there are not trade blocks. So it's about economic cooperation and creating so-called free trade areas where goods and services can pass between countries without restrictions. So these have a number of benefits and challenges that we will be looking at. Okay, firstly, we need to define what economic systems comprise. Okay, economic system is a system of production and management of wealth, science, time, or resources for effectiveness. So it's how we produce goods and services, and integration relates to incorporating or combining different countries into an integrated whole. And then trade is a commercial exchange of goods and services or skilled practices and buying and selling of goods and services across borders. So when they integrated, effectively countries are work together as if they do not have borders with regards to certain goods and services. A trade bloc or a bloc is a group of countries in a special alliance, for example, the European Economic Community or the European Union. Basically, if you travel to the EU, you need one visa and you can travel to any of these countries, and they have very few borders between them. So you can travel across the border between two countries and not even realize it. Free refers to being able to act at will or not held or fixed costing, no restrictions. So a free market is basically where goods and services are traded without restrictions or taxes. And an area is a particular geographic area or region with a definite boundary. So a specific area, if you look at the graphic of the EU, so the whole blue area is the European Economic Union. So trade happens freely between all those countries that are colored in blue within that graphic. So what is economic integration about? Economic integration is a grouping of countries by an agreement or treaty. So the leaders of the countries come together and they make an agreement about what conditions there will be on the movement of goods and services between these countries. It generally takes place on a regional basis. So, sorry, I don't know, I'm repeating myself now, but it generally takes place on a regional basis. So, countries that are located close to one another in order to form a trade bloc that secures benefits for the participating member states. How does it do this? Through reducing or eliminating of tariffs and removal of non-tariff barriers in the cross-border movement of goods, services, capital, and or labor. Okay, so what does it mean? It means a number of countries come together and they basically agree to open their borders to one another in relation to certain goods, services, and even between or with regards people, employees moving across these borders with minimal restrictions and requirements. Okay, importantly, you have three levels of economic integration. So, on the lowest level, which is number 3, is bilateral economic integration, which is a trade agreement between two countries. For example, South Africa has a bilateral trade agreement with Namibia, and we've got bilateral trade agreements with Botswana, Swaziland, Lesotho, but it's specific agreements between South Africa and these countries, so not together, bilateral between two countries, which means that goods and services can move across the borders freely. So with South Africa and Namibia, you can take practically anything you like into Namibia and bring anything out of Namibia, bar meat products. So they will not check you at the border other than that you're not carrying meat products that can carry diseases. But otherwise, you can carry any products you like across the border without having to declare them and having to pay taxes or levies on these products. The second level is known as regional economic integration. And here you have a number of countries in the same geographic region who have a treaty with one another. So the same idea, they remove trade barriers that allow them to move goods and services across the borders freely between these countries and even labor across borders freely. And then the largest level is global economic integration, which is governed by the World Trade Organization, WTO, and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. So they aim to create one large global market where goods and services essentially can move across the globe freely. However, the IMF and the World Bank are influenced to a large degree by the United States and by the EU, which has certain implications for so-called free trade between countries. But I will touch on that again just now. Okay. Now, you also have stages of economic integration. So countries don't just come together and open their borders overnight. It normally takes time, and economic integration normally builds up slowly. So the first stage of economic integration is what is known as a free trade area. So regional economic grouping of countries in which tariffs and non-tariff barriers are abolished. Example of this is NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Association, which basically means that goods and services can move across the borders between, in this instance, the United States, America, and Canada, with little restrictions. So they're not taxed when these goods move across borders, and there's not a whole lot of restrictions, and you don't need permits to move these goods across the borders, etc. Okay, but this can create problems. Why? Because one of the countries can import goods and from outside and import them at a lower levy or charge less taxes on the goods than another country does within your free trade area. This means that all this type of product will flow in through a certain country. Let's use the example of cigarettes, which are heavily taxed. Let's say they're countries A, B, and C within your free trade union, and country A charges 20 Rand tax on a packet of cigarettes, country B 15 Rand tax, and country C only 5 Rand tax. Then it's going to have the implication that all the cigarettes come in through country C and then are distributed to country A and B, who will lose their tax income from cigarettes. So this leads to the creation of what is known as a customs union. And the difference between a customs union and a free trade area is that in a customs union, you have a common border and everyone agrees on a common tax for certain products, and often the tariffs are then pooled and distributed between the countries according to an agreement, for example, based on the size of the countries, etc. So let's say a common standard is generated that 15 Rand will be charged on each packet of cigarettes imported. So all three countries, A, B, and C, charge at 15 Rand, no matter where the cigarettes are imported. And then at the end of the day, the pool is divided up between the three countries based on the customs union agreement. The third stage is known as a common market. Okay, in a customs union that is established by member nations to liberalize, it is a customs union that is established by member nations to liberalize the movement of regional production factors. So in a common market, for example, the European Economic Community, now goods and services can move across borders freely, almost without restrictions. So in the example of the EEC, there are no limitations of the goods. It's not just certain goods that can move across the borders freely. All goods can move across the borders within the EEC as you like. So there aren't border checks. People move across the borders. You need one visa, etc. And then the most advanced form of economic integration is known as an economic union. Now, the economic union takes things one step further. So they create a common parliament or a common administrator who sets rules for the whole economic union with regards things like monetary policy and health and safety and standards regarding goods and services. So here you've got the European Parliament that essentially makes decisions about monetary policies such as taxation, import taxes, health and safety issues regarding food and other things. So you've got, each country is still an independent country, but you've given part of that independence away to a central government where you have representation, and it sets consistent policies and standards for the whole economic union. If you have been watching the news, this is one of the reasons why the United Kingdom left the EU with Brexit. They wanted to set their own economic and monetary policies and didn't want to be dictated to by the European Parliament. So, what are the effects of economic integration on trade? Okay, Adam Smith speaks about absolute advantage. We looked at his theory, absolute and relative advantages, in the first chapter. But different countries have different advantages, and this allows for the free movement of goods and services between these countries, and it means that goods can be traded easily and more effectively between them. Similarly, Ricardo's comparative advantage, it makes sense that certain countries produce goods that they are better suited to, and by enabling the movement of goods and services, it means that countries within your economic bloc do not have to produce goods that they do not produce efficiently or effectively. Okay, so the benefits of economic integration. So it's argued that there are a number of benefits. In the short term, two possibilities: trade creation, so production shifts to more efficient member countries from inefficient member countries. So what happens is, instead of having to produce goods locally that you do so inefficiently and thus very expensively, you can now import goods cheaply with very little red tape and hassles. The second advantage in the short term is trade diversion. So production shifts production shifts to inefficient member countries from more efficient outsiders and shift in domestic consumption. So what happens is that it encourages countries to start their own businesses within these economic blocs, and it keeps out other traders or countries outside the economic bloc, and thus creates business opportunities. The dynamic long-term effects are that there's a potential for the reduction in production costs, because you are now moving the production of goods to more efficient countries, i.e. countries where labor costs are lower, raw material costs are lower, and you're also achieving maximum production within your production facilities. So how do you achieve economic efficiency and growth? There's increased competition between member nations that produce similar goods or services, and you exploit economies of scale. That was the term I was trying to come to. So economy of scale means that factories that can produce a certain amount of goods are able to manufacture goods at their maximum capacity, because they can now sell these goods throughout the economic bloc and not just within the single country where they are located. So it improves market sizes, creates more customers, and also creates the potential for foreign direct investments, i.e. It makes the markets more attractive because investors from outside can then come into one country and they can trade with 5 or 10 other countries without restrictions. Okay, there are a number of major trade blocs. I'm not going to expect you to know each one of these. It is simply a guideline. You would have also used this in your assignment when identifying different trade blocs, but it's to illustrate the point that there are several trade blocs across the globe and that countries often belong to more than one trade bloc. So it doesn't mean because you belong to one trade bloc that you can't belong to a second or even a third trade bloc with a different set of countries. So the first one we're going to look at is BRICS, and I'm sure you've heard of BRICS. But I'm going to show you a short video on BRICS just to illustrate what BRICS is about and let you look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of this form of economic integration. So you need to watch the video on BRICS, and then so the video is what are the BRICS countries. I've given you the details how to find the video, which is on Blackboard, but I've given you the URL and what you can search for on YouTube as well. Important, okay, so when you watch the video, you need to take notes and answer the following questions. What is BRICS? What are the implications for BRICS, for the countries in BRICS? And what are the threats to BRICS? Same story, guys. Watch the video, answer questions yourself before you look at the feedback. Okay, so what is BRICS? BRICS is an acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So it is a trade bloc created between these 5 countries where they have made an agreement to reduce trades and tariffs on the movement of certain goods between these countries. Okay, so why have they done or created BRICS? Okay, so they mention a number of advantages. So these countries together have half the world's population. They have a quarter of the world's land mass and 1/5 of the gross domestic product. So together they have the same GDP as the United States. Okay. They have also created something called created a development bank, or the BRICS Bank, which is to counteract the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, i.e. not to be behest to the United States and Europe and Western countries in terms of lending money, etc. So loan money is not restricted, and they can loan money between the members and between or to other countries. Okay, so I mentioned some advantage. India's got a huge middle class. It's becoming very rich, so prosperous middle class. Brazil produces oil and iron and has the sixth largest economy in the world, or had the sixth largest economy in the world. They also mention the strength of China, etc. So it makes sense for these countries to work together. They mention that South Africa is the smallest country within BRICS, both in terms of our population, which is vastly smaller. We only have 50 million people compared to the smallest in those groups, which is probably Brazil, with about 500 or 600 million people. Okay, but South Africa provides a foothold for China and India and some of the other countries also to access Africa, so to start trade within Africa and to move into the rest of Africa. And South Africa has one of the strongest economies in Africa, although we have lately been surpassed by Nigeria, but we still have one of the biggest and most efficiently run economies in Africa, which is hopefully still the case after the pandemic. Okay, now, what are the challenges or the disadvantages of BRICS? They mention that Russia, for example, has a number of problems. They've got a declining population. There are various sanctions against them, and they've not been doing so well economically. Resources are becoming depleted. All these countries have growing populations, which is problematic in the sense of that you struggle to prosper if your population is growing too much, because you struggle to provide them with jobs and look after a hugely growing population. And then they mention the fact that China dominates BRICS. So while it has China's economy is as big as the 5 other BRICS members combined. So China largely calls the shots within BRICS, and China also has issues with human rights and various conflicts with its neighbors, as you will see in the next video. Well, perhaps not, sorry. They have conflicts over the South China Sea, and if you're watching the news at the moment, China is in a trade war with the United Nations, which does not help any of our situations. Okay, so I'm just going to go through the different slides with the different trade blocks. As I said, you don't have to know each one of them. This is just to illustrate to you how many different trade blocks there are in the world, and this is not an exhaustive list of these trade blocks. So you've got Europe and the European Economic Union, which is probably the most well-known one of the whole lot. You've got NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Association, which I mentioned earlier, United States, Canada, and Mexico. South America, you've got Mercosur, which consists of, you've got Mercosur, which is Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, and a couple of other countries. You've also got the Andean Common Market. You've got Central American Common Markets. In the Americas, you've got the Latin American Integration Association. You've got Asia. You've got the ASEAN countries. Okay. The ASEAN countries are important, guys. Oh no, sorry, I'm going ahead of myself. You've got the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, which is SARC, and you then have the ASEAN countries, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Okay, why I'm mentioning these specifically is because we'll look at them now in a video, but the 10 countries that it comprises of: Cambodia, Brunei, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam, which I can boast I've been to 7 of the 10 countries, and it's a pretty amazing area. But I'm not choosing this one for any particular reason other than it illustrates the advantages and disadvantages of economic integration quite effectively. Okay, so I'm going to show you, or you're going to look at 2 videos now about ASEAN economic integration. The first video will look at the advantages of economic integration, and the second one will look at some of the disadvantages. So you need to watch the first video and ask yourself, what are the positive advantages for ASEAN economic integration? Same rules apply, guys. Sit, watch the video, take notes, and make sure that you can answer the question for yourself, and then have a look at the feedback. I provide you with the details for the to access the video, Blackboard, the URL, or you can just search for YouTube for the ASEAN community by 2015. Okay, assuming that you've sat down and looked at the video and you've written your own answer, see how your answer compares to this. Okay, so firstly, it's obvious that this video is propaganda for ASEAN. In other words, it is a video created by people who are in favor of ASEAN and who basically selling it to school kids. So it is a cartoon, I know, but it puts across a number of important points. So the first key advantage mention, okay, in terms of peace, when countries are in an economic or economically integrated, they generally do not go to war with one another. And this also helps them. They work with one another against terrorism, against pirates, against drug trafficking, etc. So it tends to create a more peaceful region because everyone is invested in working together to become richer. And that is also the second advantage, prosperity. So they argue that working together, you develop economically, so countries become richer. It attracts investment or foreign investment because it is attractive for foreign investors because they can access one country or move into one country but have access to 9 other countries at the same time with very little effort. So businesses grow, more businesses open, they claim there's more jobs and opportunities for the people within the bloc, and agriculture becomes more advanced because technology comes in because it's so attractive, and also that people within the bloc will be able to work where they choose to work. So it allows them to move freely within the bloc. They also argue that quality of life becomes better. So people's lives, people's life generally becomes better. How? Better infrastructure, better roads and transport. So these countries want to be able to transport goods and services between one another. So that creates the incentives for building airports, ports, better quality roads, etc. High-tech innovation, so better communication. The countries become more communicated with or connected to one another via communication, internet, cell phones, etc., and they become better connected to the outside world. And essentially, it helps people to prosper, to become richer, and the richer you become, the better your lifestyle is. They also argue that when you help one another, you prosper because you're working together as opposed to working against one another. Also, the people will benefit. Specific benefits, they argue, will be cleaner and greener societies because they're working better to save the environment. Where in the case of disasters, they work together to provide assistance for disasters and communicate and work together on disaster relief. In the case of diseases, if you're working together, you can help prevent disease or contain disease more effectively because you're communicating with one another and you're also working together to treat the diseases. But also they mention the sharing of culture and that countries can learn from each other, and thus when you learn cultures you also become more tolerant at the end of the day. The next video is about the negative implications. So the video looks at what are the negative implications for the ASEAN economic or for ASEAN economic integration for workers. The first video painted this wonderful picture that had the rainbow in the background and the circus master telling you how wonderful and great everything is. The second video is a more critical perspective of economic integration. So you need to watch the video ASEAN Economic Integration that benefits all by ASETUC and FES. Sorry, saying that again. You need to watch the video Economic Integration that benefits all by ASETUC and FES. The details are provided of the video. Same deal, guys. Don't try to answer the questions first. Again, guys, it goes into your head when you sit and answer the questions for yourself, as opposed to just reading the feedback and getting spoon-fed. But also, you're less likely to remember the answers if you have not worked it out for yourself. Okay, so the second video provides a much more critical view of economic integration, and it's also set up by a trade union that says that actually this isn't as wonderful as they claim. There are a number of negative consequences of economic integration that they need to take into account. So what do they mention here? Okay, it says, firstly, a small group of workers benefits from economic integration. So the workers that will be able to travel between countries and the workers who will earn better salaries, etc., tend to be your most qualified and skilled workers, and your lowly qualified workers will not benefit, and in many instances they will actually become poorer. They also mentioned that big multinational corporations and large local companies are the organizations that have the knowledge, capital, and resources in order to compete effectively, and that many small and medium businesses will in fact close down because they will not be able to compete with these large enterprises. They further mentioned that job security will suffer. Why? Because short-term or outsourced or short-term contract jobs will rise, while long-term secure jobs will tend to diminish within the marketplace. So basically, people will get poorer in the long run, especially those with few skills or who are lowly skilled at the end of the day. Okay, and then they also speak of a race to the bottom. So they say in order to become attractive to these large multinational corporations, what countries' governments do is they lower taxes for these corporations, which means that the governments earn less money to benefit their populations. So the social sector suffers, in other words, looking after your population, and social and labor standards tend to diminish to please these multinational corporations. So actually people's job security diminishes, as well as often things like health and safety standards in the workplace. So it is clear that economic integration is not all sunshine and roses, as the first video would like to suggest. Okay, the next couple of slides illustrate some more economic blocks. The first one is Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. If you look at all the countries situated around the Pacific Ocean, so it is countries in Asia, North America, Australia, New Zealand, and South America that cooperate with one another here. Similarly, you have the Indian Ocean Rim Association, where countries around the Indian Ocean, of which we also form a part of this agreement. And then you've got Africa, the African Caribbean and Pacific group of states, the Arab Maghreb Union, UMA, which is Mauritania, Morocco, Algeria, and Libya up the north of Africa. You have ECOWAS, which is the Economic Community of West African States. You've got the Economic Community of the Great Lake Countries, Central African Customs and Economic Union, the Common Market of Eastern and Southern Africa, South African, okay. Important one in South African terms is SADC, which is the Southern African Development Community, of which South Africa forms a prominent role, but it's the whole of Southern Africa up to the Democratic Republic of Congo and Tanzania. Has a number of objectives which you can see on the slide over here. So to promote sustainability and equitable economic growth, common political values, to defend and consolidate democracy, to promote self-sustaining development, to achieve complementarity between national and regional strategies, so to get us to work together, to promote employment, achieve sustainable use of natural resources, to build links between countries, combat HIV/AIDS, eradicate poverty, and mainstream the gender within the process of community building. So it has a number of objectives to benefit all of the countries that form part of SADC. Okay, so in the case of SADC, it is a legally binding treaty. So all these countries have signed a treaty and they adhere, or where they agree to adhere to those objectives, and it has a particular structure. So it's got a chairman and it has regular meetings, etc. And the chairman, for example, rotates between the presidents of various countries. We also have SACU, which is the South African Customs Union, which is a customs agreement between South Africa, Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, and Swaziland, which basically allows for the free movement of goods between these member countries. So there are almost no import duties or restrictions on the movement of goods between these countries. Okay. So lastly, guys, what are the criteria for successful regional trade blocs and trade agreements? So what makes a trade bloc successful or work properly? Firstly, countries should be geographically close to one another and have easy access to one another. So the point is, if you are close to one another, you can easily move goods and services across one another's borders, although BRICS is an exception to this rule, but it is also one of the weaknesses of BRICS. Secondly, there should be easy mobility between these countries, so you need a good transport system, so proper roads, air travel, sea links, etc., in order to be able to move goods between these countries. Natural resources should be available, and preferably different natural resources in each country, so that the different countries complement each other from this agreement. Fourth criteria is that there should be diverse labor capacities and manufacturing skills, i.e., if each country has its own set of skills and skilled types of people, it means that people will not all flow into one country at the end of the day. So one of the problems with SADC is, for instance, that we have got lots of lowly skilled people in all of the economies, which results in people flowing towards South Africa, which has more job opportunities, etc. So it is a challenge if you do not have different skill sets within each country. Having an entrepreneurial culture is very important. So you need people who start businesses within these countries, guys, to get things going, and who look for business opportunities and want to start new things. There must be a formal agreement between these countries, guys. It's very important that there is a formal agreement that specifies what the conditions are of the movements of goods and services between these countries, and then also regulates this. So it's not just an all open borders, etc. There's a clear understanding of what goods and services can move across borders freely, and if there are duties on goods and services, what these will be, etc. And then finally, there should be an internal free trade within the regional trade bloc. That's important, guys. So between your countries, you should be able to trade freely. There should be a limitation of restrictions. Just to repeat, between these countries, guys, there should be free trade. In other words, there should not be a limitation on the movements in goods and services, but you also need to have customs union on the border of these countries, so that one country does not benefit more by charging less tax on the import of certain goods from outside states, which would result in all the goods moving from one state into the others. Okay, you should have done these questions already, but you've got the answers in your notes above. Sorry, I'm repeating myself. You would have done these questions already if you were in class, but you've also got the answers in the notes above here. So you need to work through these questions and make sure that you answer all of the questions over here. As usual, guys, these 5 questions are the questions that you will find in the test or in the exam.